Good afternoon. Well, today, April 23rd, is the established birthday of William Shakespeare. This is one of my favorite days of the year, and hopefully, when I finish this presentation, this will show why. Shakespeare is not just my favorite writer, he's also one of the most important writers in world history. And I hope this presentation will show that he's actually all around us, whether we notice it or not. This is a poster of Shakespeare this is a painting of Shakespeare that came out only a few years ago. The cupcake and the party hat were added later. So, Shakespeare was born, and as far as we know, he was born and died on the same day, April 23rd. He lived from 1564 to 1616. He lived to be 52, which was a ripe old age back in those days. There are more than 80 variants for the spelling of his name. His plays are made up of a total of 884,429 words. And a lot is known about his work, but there's very little known about his personal life. One thing we do know, though, is that in 1583, he married Anne Hathaway. Wait, not that one. Yeah, there we go, that one. His wife, Anne, he married while he was still a teenager. That's about the only thing we know of that was in any way similar to the story of Romeo and Juliet. The fact that Shakespeare married young, and actually his wife was 3 months pregnant when she and Shakespeare tied the knot. Again, a lot more is known about Shakespeare's work than his personal life. We do know this, though. He was the third of 8 children, but his elder siblings died, possibly due to plague. So that meant that Shakespeare became the eldest son. You can see in this picture Shakespeare as almost a patriarch with his 3 children. His son, Hamnet, his daughter, Susanna, and his other daughter, Judith, who she and Hamnet were twins. Sadly, Hamnet died at age 11 in 1596. There's actually a book that was recently published called Hamnet that posits that Shakespeare's grief for losing his young son might have inspired him to write the work Hamlet, since the two are so closely spelled. Now, Shakespeare wrote 39 attributed plays, 154 sonnets, which are short poems, 4 epic poems, which are long poems, and might have had a hand in writing the King James Bible. Back in Shakespeare's day, playwrights were called poets, and his upper-class patrons demanded beautiful poetry. The kind of poetry he uses most frequently is called Iambic Pentameter, and it mimics the human heartbeat. Compared to Shakespeare's contemporaries, he wrote closer than them in terms of replicating conversational, everyday human speech. And that's one reason why he is still played and still studied today. But he still had to write within the form of poetry. That's what his patrons demanded, which is why his language is a little bit tricky to get into at first. Another interesting fact, Shakespeare's theater burned down twice. Shakespeare was famous for creating the Globe Theater. Well, he was famous for being the house playwright at the Globe Theater, and where he acted and wrote. He was also a shareholder. He helped put money to get it built. It was built in 1599, but then in 1613, during a performance of his play Henry VIII, it burned down. You see, there was a cannon that was part of the show, and it went off, and a spark from the cannon caused the wooden playhouse to catch fire and burn down. It was rebuilt a few years later, but then it burned down again in 1666 during the Great Fire of London, which burned down a third of the entire city. Then it was rebuilt in 1997 by an American actor, Sam Wanamaker, but sadly it was closed last year due to COVID-19 restrictions. Clearly, this all illustrates that theater was a risky business to be in, then as now. And Shakespeare had to put a great deal of trust, money, and faith in making a name for himself in theater, because you never knew what was going to happen to your investments. Shakespeare never went to college. A lot of people claim that the fact that Shakespeare didn't have a university degree, that this is evidence that Shakespeare couldn't have written his plays and they must have been written by somebody with a degree. But what those people miss is that the curricula for young boys at the time was considerably different from the type of education that kids have nowadays. Back then, at the Stratford Grammar School, young men studied rhetoric and poetry and literature and ancient history, the kinds of liberal arts that a man would need to become a successful playwright. Plus, Shakespeare must have spent a great deal of time as a member of theatrical companies. A lot of his best scripts were actually ripped off from older pieces like the Troublesome Tragedy of Richard III, the famous Victories of Henry V, and copies of Plutarch's Lives and the Chronicles of Hall and Holinshed. So Shakespeare had plenty of education to learn how to write and also to look things up. So, and it's also, I bring this up because it's encouraging to modern teenagers that even though the modern education focuses on science and history and mathematics and music and many other things, we still study the basics of history, rhetoric, persuasive speaking, and writing. And that's also why Shakespeare is taught in schools, because he learned so well how to adapt and use those skills in his writing. But that doesn't mean that everything he wrote was highfalutin, because Shakespeare also invented the knock-knock joke, and over 1,700 words. No other author in history has created more words and phrases than Shakespeare. And that's another reason why we study him. His contribution to the English language is unsurpassed by any other writer. Here are some common words that we get from Shakespeare. I'll point out a few here. Accommodation, gnarled, majestic, obscene, premeditated, indistinguishable, invulnerable, laughable. But then there are simple words like lonely, road, gloomy, frugal, critic. 95% of Shakespeare's vocabulary are words that we still use today. And even though high schoolers are often intimidated when they first look at Shakespeare's plays, it is important to remember that his language has not changed very much in the past 400 years. His syntax and diction is a little bit different because he, again, had to adapt whatever he wrote into the form of poetry. But he did it in a way that we have continued to use in our language for 400 years. He invented many household words. In fact, he invented the term household words. Another great contribution of Shakespeare is the various characters and stories that he created. Shakespeare's plays fall into three basic categories: tragedies, comedies, and histories. In a tragedy like Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, Othello, Macbeth, and Hamlet, the main character always dies, usually due to something called the tragic flaw, a problem in their character that leads to their destruction. They are often very emotional plays that reveal some kind of truth of human nature. In Shakespeare's comedies, they are usually about love. They have simpler themes, well, more complicated plots, and they have jokes, but they're more about making fun um, of city or country life. Plays like A Midsummer Night's Dream, The Merry Wives of Windsor, The Tempest, and Cymbeline. And in Shakespeare's history plays, well, they're obviously based on English history. All of his tragedies are based on something happening in another country. His histories are all about real English kings who are either getting the crown put on their heads or having the crown taken off their heads, or quite frequently losing their heads in the pursuit of the crown. So in a tragedy, people are dying. In a comedy, there's a wedding, and in history, there's a crowning. Or as I like to put it, wedding, crowning, and beheading. So again, Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, Othello, Hamlet, and Macbeth. Those are all tragedies. Richard II is a history play. Cymbeline, The Tempest, and A Midsummer Night's Dream are comedies. I'm going to skip this slide because it's a video, but suffice it to say, Shakespeare's characters and his phrases are everywhere in our culture. You'll notice this famous image of Hamlet holding the skull that has been replicated everywhere from children's television to Star Wars, with Chewbacca holding the head of C-3PO. His lines, again, are household words, and many modern stories have influence in Shakespeare. People often say that Disney's The Lion King is basically a revamping of Hamlet. Well, I would argue that every single Marvel movie and superhero movie in general has a brooding hero that is often trying to avenge the death of somebody very close to them, which gets its roots from Shakespeare's Hamlet. So, a final reason, not just Shakespeare's ability to coin phrases, but his ability to create characters and stories that have lasted through the ages, is the real reason why we study him. Again, Shakespeare can be intimidating the first time you read him. You have to read footnotes. There are lots of characters. The plots are complicated. There are plenty of, there is a small number of words that are confusing and hard to understand. But the amazing thing is, if you stick with it, I guarantee you will find something you like. And I leave you with this quote from Robert Graves to illustrate that. The remarkable thing about Shakespeare is that he really is very good, in spite of all the people who say he is very good. When you look at a Shakespeare play for the first time, keep an open mind. Ask yourself what you like. Was there a phrase that jumped out? Was there a speech that you liked? Did something a character did resonate with you on a personal level? Can you think of a story that reminds you of something you've read in a Shakespeare play? And if the play you read doesn't speak to you,